TGC Requiem. This is a deck tech for Death Shadow Abzan. Somebody requested me to do this and saw an Abzan list that was worth running, and so I'm here to talk about it. Played almost 7 leagues with this list now, and it's felt pretty steady. Hasn't been the most explosive, but I think part of it is learning kind of how to play it. It plays a little different than the other Death Shadows. This list is basically a heavy port from the list that Reed Duke played in San Antonio for the team event. Because it was a team event, I think some of his choices were kind of geared a little bit towards that, and based on my thoughts in that regard and my experiences, I've made some minor tweaks. Pretty much not a whole lot to the main, just a path to exile in place of the murderous cut, but a little different approach for the sideboard than what he had. So we'll go ahead and run through the list. First, I'm just going to touch on Death Shadow in general for anybody who doesn't happen to understand or know what a Death Shadow deck does. The key card is Death Shadow. Death Shadow gets -X, where X is your life total, which sounds like a negative, and it is, in the fact that basically if your life total is really high, Death Shadow just instantly dies. But if your life total gets pretty low, you can spend 1 mana to get out up to a 12/12, because if you get to 0 life, obviously you've lost the game, short of a few tricks you can do with things like Phyrexian Unlife, where you can technically get into a negative life total. But the Death Shadows tend to be a 1 mana card that you play for around around 8 life or so it ends up being like a 1 mana 5/5 or so, and it obviously can scale and get bigger as you get closer to death, which means it closes games out really fast. And so you play a lot of shock lands, and you play a lot of fetch lands, you play Street Wraith, and Thoughtseize as ways to lose life and basically turbo yourself down to a low enough life total that Death Shadow can become a pretty big creature pretty quick. And so to get to those cards, you play cards like Mishra's Bauble and Street Wraith, which also obviously is one of the cards that you would use to make your Death Shadows bigger, because it has the cycling pay 2 life function on the card. But it also cycles essentially for free, right? You don't have to pay anything other than the 2 life, which you want to do to make your shadows bigger. And similarly, Mishra's Bauble is a way to sacrifice or play a 0 mana card that replaces itself, and those 2 cards essentially make your deck smaller, and you're actually fetching quite a bit, so that helps make your deck smaller, which allows you to get to all the cards in your deck that are just gas. Similarly, Traverse the Uvenwald allows you to search your library for basic land cards and put it into your hand. But if you get Delirium turned on, which is 4 types of cards in your own graveyard, you can actually use it to search for a specific creature or land card, any creature or land card, and put it into your hand. And so this also helps tighten your deck up and allow you to get to the cards you want to get to really quickly. I've been playing some Grixis Shadow lately, and it's very good, but it is... I really missed the Traverse the Uvenwalds to get the creatures that I wanted to help close out the game, and so I wanted to try this Abzan Shadow list partially because of that. So, so that's kind of how you get to this Titan deck, where really you're looking at these core cards in the middle as what you're kind of trying to play with. Since you're trying to turn on Delirium for Traverse the Uvenwald, to tighten the deck up. It's not so much, I mean, you are wanting to turn on Delirium, but because you're trying to tighten this deck up into these powerful threats, you also play Tarmogoyf because you're putting a lot of card types in your graveyard pretty fast. You don't get it to the size that you might get it into a Death Shadow Jund, because you're not running, Tarfires for tribal and whatnot. But your Tarmogoyfs are still bigger than most creatures on the battlefield, except for maybe your opposing Death Shadows. And so, basically, with the Tarmogoyfs, They play really well with Traverse the Uvenwald and Mishra's Bauble. You just get a lot of these little synergies. Street Wraith being able to put a creature directly into your graveyard from your hand as a combat trick to make your Tarmogoyfs bigger during combat sometimes, or to make your Death Shadows bigger in combat. Also good. And then Grim Flayer is your other threat. Another threat is just a 2/2, but you turn on Delirium so quickly and so efficiently with this deck that he becomes a 4/4 with Trample, and then he kind of has like a pseudo, I don't want to call it Brainstorm or Ponder, but basically, maybe Preordain's the best example, and that's not even accurate either, but basically lets you look at the top 3 cards, and then you can put any number of those cards into the graveyard and any number back on top of your library in any order. And so it really helps you filter your draws. In certain matchups, this card's just not good. In other matchups, it's phenomenal. Helps you draw to the cards you really need. I actually find myself traversing for Grim Flayer a lot more than I would expect, because in empty boards, or against like really small creatures, he really just helps you find the pieces you need to close the game. So with all the shadow decks, you're playing typically, not all of them, but most of them, you're playing typically 8 hand disruption spells, the 4 Inquisitions, the 4 Thoughtseize. Thoughtseize, again, the life loss helps grow your Death Shadows, but this allows you to really attack your opponent's hand, turn 1 to get into ideally a turn 2 Tarmogoyf or Grim Flayer, even sometimes turn 2 Death Shadows, and hope, or essentially really set up a scenario where it can live through the next turn, or next couple turns. Also Fatal Push, just very simple removal, 1 CMC, great removal that's come out with Aether Revolt and Aether Revolt, Kaladesh. Now I can't remember if this came out in Kaladesh or Aether Revolt, but either way, it's a great card, great removal spell. And then I replaced the Murderous Cut from Reduke's list for a couple reasons. Certainly I like the extra piece of removal. I agree with his point that right now you want to make sure all of your removal spells, when we're running Path, 4 Fatal Push and 3 Abrupt Decays, you want to make sure all of your removal spells can handle all of the threats in the Shadow Jund deck, and they all can. And Murderous Cut was what he was using. The reason I switched is I feel like there's been a lot more decks as people are starting to adjust to Shadow decks more. Voice of Resurgence, Tron actually becomes a little bit better. Not that Shadow Jund can't beat Tron, because Shadow Jund absolutely can beat Tron, but it's not like a blowout. And Path to Exile can get rid of like your Wormcoil engines. It can get rid of an Ulamog that might otherwise mill you out or something like that. And so there's a lot of recursive creatures, Kitchen Finks, things like that I want to get rid of them permanently, and so I prefer the Path to Murderous Cut. And then also the Murderous Cut does shrink your Tarmogoyfs. It makes your Grim Flayers and Traverse the Uvenwalds lose Delirium sometimes, and so that's just why I'm running the Path over the Murderous Cut. It's the only white card in the main board, and I think part of the reason why Reduke, he mentioned that he doesn't necessarily think that Path to Exile is a great card in Modern, but basically he also wanted to make sure his deck was all black-green in the main deck, so that he didn't have to fetch for any of his white, so he could always go get the Overgrown Tombs first. And most of the time we do anyway, because there's not a whole lot of matchups where Path to Exile is necessarily necessary, but in the matchups where it is, it's significantly better than Murderous Cut. And then Abrupt Decay, part of the reason I like playing Abrupt Decay over, say, like Terminates and like a Grixis or Shadow Jund build are, while those cards are fantastic for what they do, Abrupt Decay can also play really well against like just problematic permanents like Ensnaring Bridge and Phyrexian Unlife, just everything. And so I really like Abrupt Decay for that matter. The other thing that Reduke kind of, I'll say, innovated in the Abzan, or in the Shadow list, was playing for Liliana. And Liliana is phenomenal in this build. Again, you are basically playing this almost like a regular Abzan deck. There are definitely going to be matchups where you'll draw, and you're going to be aggressively trying to get your life total low as fast as possible so you can get those Death Shadows online, specifically against combo decks and maybe Tron decks. But then a lot of the other decks, you just kind of want to play more conservatively and set yourself up to, kill certain creatures, buy yourself some time to set up a Tarmogoyf to hold the fort down, and you don't have the ability to liberally fetch into shocks for the Death Shadow because you may not turn on Death Shadow. Maybe you're playing against a deck with Relics and Relic of Progenitus, and you're not confident you're ever going to be able to get to your Death Shadows and traverse the Uvenwald, and so you're just running your life total down too low, too quick. And so anyway, point being is, you just have the ability to play a more normal Abzan game with the 4 Lilianas and essentially all the rest of the cards that Abzan plays. So that is the main deck. It's pretty good. It's pretty consistent, pretty steady. Again, a little weaker against the combo decks and a little weaker against the go wide aggro decks. Even though you have a lot of cheap interaction and removal, you don't have the ability to Temur Battle Rage over them and use the aggressiveness of themselves against them. And so the deck is a little weaker in those matchups, but it's significantly better in the Shadow Mirrors, I found. Obviously, again, Path, Fatal Push, Abrupt Decay all kills your opponent's creatures. Liliana the Veil essentially wins the game on its own. Typically, Liliana the Veil comes down, you down tick, make them sacrifice a creature. Their creatures don't have haste, and so you usually can just like uptick it and then make them. They get stuck in the situation where they have to play 2 creatures in a single turn, or else they're kind of done. And if they don't play 2 creatures in a single turn, if they play the one, Liliana's just going to down tick and make them sacrifice the creature, and then you uptick, make them discard the card if they don't play it right away. They have to. It's not to say that you can't beat a Liliana the Veil once it's down, but Liliana the Veil once it's down is tremendous in the mirrors. As to the sideboard, the other big reason why Reed Duke was playing the Abzan Shadow, along with it being really good in the mirror, just you have access to phenomenal sideboard cards in white, which is the common saying. So here I'm actually playing an extra Path to Exile, so where I want to bring in a second path, I can. Most of the time Fatal Push is good enough, but sometimes it's just not good at all. And so I have a second path in the main to help fight against those decks. Stony Silence to help fight against the Affinity, Lantern, Tron decks, to buy yourself some time in those matchups to hopefully close the game out. Or at least buy yourself time to get to like an Abrupt Decay against Lantern so that you can blow up their Ensnaring Bridges, things like that. Lingering Souls helps against Affinity, helps against any of the decks that are trying to beat you with heavy removal. On top of playing, the Tarmogoyfs and Death Shadows, you do have 2 Grim Flayers, so the deck is already playing a heavier creature count than, the normal Shadow lists do. And so adding some Lingering Souls makes this a little tougher for the control decks than maybe the normal Shadow Jund would be. Ranger of Eos also for the grindy matchups. It just blows my mind how frequently this card comes down and immediately goes and gets 2 Death Shadows and it resolves. Like, it's just, you do so much hand disruption and, they spend so much interaction trying to keep up with your board that by the time it's time to cast the Ranger of Eos, you typically get it down, it typically resolves, and you get to go get 2 more Death Shadows to keep applying pressure. Collective Brutality, your best card against Burn. Good against a lot of strategies. I like bringing it in against control decks because it's another way to go get cryptic commands. It's a way to go get your ad nauseums from your combo opponent players. It's just got a lot of uses against elves. You can kill a creature and take a collected company. Lots of cool things. This is probably the biggest change I have from Reed Duke's list. I felt like he did run some more grindy elements in his deck, and I replaced those grindy elements like Renegade Rallier, and I think maybe it was a 3rd Lingering Souls, I'm not quite sure, but I replaced them with 2 Liliana the Last Hopes. And in my playing with Shadow Jund and even Grixis Shadow, or Shadow Jund and Shadow Grixis, she's just great. In certain matchups like Affinity and Elves and things like that, she can just shut down the opponent's game plan single-handedly turn after turn while upticking. In some matchups, she's just going to allow you to recur creatures. In control matchups, recur creatures back from the graveyard. And then she's a win condition in some matches as well. And then Scavenging Ooze, we'll also bring up Fulminator Mage. Another way to kind of help fight Tron decks, and sometimes it's okay against Valakut Breach, but I do find that in this deck it's just not quite as good as the other ones. Certainly you would love to have 3 of them, but you're already kind of behind enough in some matchups where it's great that you don't need it, because it's like, why spend the slots? It doesn't make that big of an impact. And or you just have a fair enough matchup against other decks you might want to use this in, that the grindier decks like Affinity, for example, you might want Fulminator against Affinity, but you have the Lingering Souls, Stony Silences, Lilianas. You don't need it. So that's why I'm down to 1 here, and then I have a lot more Graveyard Hate. Scavenging Ooze, a couple Nihil Spell Bombs, and Grafdigger's Cage, and these are to help fight Storm, Dredge, which is starting to see a resurgence, and then Scavenging Ooze is also good in grindier matchups where there's lots of removal. And so this is how I have Shadow Abzan built right now. I pretty much averaging 60% with the deck. I played 6 leagues so far. I've got 1, I think 2, 3, 4 3-2s and a 4-1. But I feel like I'm getting better and better with the deck as I keep playing it, which is I guess not a surprise, since that's typically how that works. But I'm definitely starting to find that this is a pretty good, solid version of the deck. I really like how I have the build set up right now, and look forward to getting another league with it for y'all to watch.